I'm Miranda Rake.
And I'm Sarah Wheeler, and this is The Mother of It All, where we take on motherhood through the lens of culture and culture through the lens of motherhood. Hello, Miss Rake.
Hello. How are you?
I'm good. I'm really excited to talk about this topic today. It's been a long time coming.
It's funny that we haven't really talked about it, the two of us. I mean, yeah.
The pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, it comes up, but I don't feel like we've had a big heart to heart of so what was that like for you?
Okay, so we can do a little bit of that today. I want to tell our listeners about this amazing survey we did and what we learned from it. And I'll heart to heart with you. I'll toss around a few hearts if you're into it. Great. Okay, that sounds good. Well, can we start by let's just do a little lay of the land.
Mm-hmm.
Miranda, would you tell everyone about our pandemic 5-year retrospective survey?
Yeah. Well, it's something we've been talking about doing for solid 6 months or so, I think, when we kind of realized 2025 is 5 years.
That's it.
And yeah, I mean, I feel like we put our heads together and we were like, let's just ask parents kind of what that was like and how are you now? And how are your kids? And how is that time still with you? And, we talked about this before a little bit, but when I was on staff at Romper, I covered pandemic related things kind of whenever I could. And just because I was still processing and I felt like parents were, even though there was kind of this mandate in the digital media world of people don't want to hear about the pandemic. So it was don't use that word, don't use the word COVID. And I thought that was really messed up. Because I
think that's one of the things we were kind of banking on was that
actually people do want to talk about it.
Yeah. And during the pandemic, there was, because of this outcry from parents, there was a bit of news about the parent experience, right? And there was some coverage there. And
Jess Gross, I feel like we got to shout out to her because I feel like she was really being the moms are screaming, the moms are screaming. And even as a mom who was feeling many feelings, I didn't feel super reflected in a lot of the media narratives about parents. It wasn't super nuanced. It felt like it was blah, and
the system is failing us. Well,
right. And you're I feel that, but I also I can't read that. I can't put my kid to bed and then open the news or whatever and then just read we're all screaming,
your life is a nightmare. Yes, but we do have to shout out Jessica Gross of the New York Times for even covering that.
Yes.
Yeah, and there were a lot of parents writing about their experiences personally. That was one thing that happened for me in the pandemic is that I started this education newsletter on a little old platform called Substack in February of 2020.
Wow.
And immediately classroom shut down. And I was like, I don't feel like writing about this anymore. What I want to write about is the fucking parenting that I'm doing all day. And so I started writing about it. Lots of people individually were writing more nuanced kind of personal essays. But since then, there hasn't been a lot of talk about it. I think partly because of what you described, that it's a bit taboo and people are worried about triggering people. There was a great John Muellum wrote something in the Times, I think last year, about this archive of pandemic experiences in that kind of March anniversary time. That was really beautiful. And I think when I saw that, I was like, thank you. Thank you for even just not for parents, but on a general population level, acknowledging that this happened. And even just documenting people's experiences and not looking away from it. So I wanted to do that for parents. Did you have other kind of motivation for exploring this?
Yeah, I think similar. About a year ago, the American Academy of Pediatrics put out a statement about the pandemic. And it was, so the American Academy of Pediatrics had 3 different presidents through, they defined the pandemic, because obviously COVID is still with us, but they defined it as with the WHO, World Health Emergency parameters. And so when that began and when that ended. So they just were reflecting on everything that happened in that time for their organization and
what was that time period?
People they care for. Yeah. So, oh gosh, I have to look up the dates.
It was like March 2020 to.
It was March,
like when
it was like
kids
March,
got vaccinated.
I think it's actually February something of 2020 when the world, when it was like, okay, this is an emergency, and then it ended. The World Health Emergency ended in like May of 2022 or something.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember. I'll look it up. We'll put it in the show notes. But so, I think they were trying to use those parameters to acknowledge that like this is really still with us, and so, but here's what we're going to here's the lines we're going to draw just to talk about this time. So they reflected on everything that happened in their organization, and because they were sort of saying like, we have to learn from this, like what went wrong, what went right, because they were basically saying like, this will happen again. Like, this is not like, oh, and that, thank God that's over. We're never going to do that again. But in the piece, they called it a trauma. And I ended up interviewing a woman who had been one of the AAP presidents during that time. And in our conversation, she said this was a time of collective trauma. And we know how to heal from trauma, but we have to do that. It doesn't just happen. Like, you have to kind of like build resiliency, and you have to invest in the systems that help people recover. So, there's a lot has been written about kids' mental health, and a lot of teachers talk about what they're seeing in classrooms post pandemic, and so it's real, and it's still parents. With us. I think it's very practically still with us. And the American Academy of Pediatrics, this huge, very important organization of like, I think it's like 60,000 pediatricians and all together, are saying like, hey, we have, this is not over, this is still with us, and now is the time that we have to like reckon and heal, and we need to do that together, just the way we experience the trauma together. And so
and focusing on kids, I think is important. Obviously we were all very focused on children's experience when it was happening.
Well, and the AAP does, they see themselves as families. They care for families. They don't just focus on kids. They really do see it as like family care. So
I mean, I think we also just had an honest curiosity about how people are thinking about this now. Are people still feeling negative effects? Are people missing it? And so I definitely want to get into in a few minutes what we saw, some of the patterns and responses that we saw.
A lot of patterns.
But that was first, I wanted to ask you, Miss Miranda Rake, where were you in March of 2020? What was your life like? I didn't know you then.
Right. So Griffin turned 2 in December of 2019, and I had just started to have a little bit of childcare. And I had also just started I've always been I've always been very anxious, and I've always had some anxiety around disease. And after becoming a mom, I think illness was a big trigger for like my anxiety. And I had just started in like a little personal victory to be okay with it when he like got a fever or got a runny nose or whatever. And I was working on that. And then the pandemic came, and it was like, never be sick. No one ever be sick. Right. And a runny nose could be this like terrible thing. And it was like, dang it. I had just like so proud of myself. And I had been in therapy actually for anxiety again. I mean, I've been in therapy for that many times, but I had just started again in October, right before that had happened. Because I was kind of like, oh, wow, my anxiety is like a lot worse since becoming a mom. I should maybe it took me 18 months to be like, oh, I should go to therapy for this. And
well, you were probably very tired.
I was very tired.
Overwhelmed otherwise.
But I actually felt like I had a leg up because I was literally in therapy working on anxiety and having some real progress. And then the world was on fire. What happened was I stayed home. We told our nanny that we were going to pause and we would keep paying her, and then to just stay home.
Mm-hmm.
And then, because both of us were able to work, so my husband would work 9 to 5, and then I would work 5 to 7 or so. And I could do
You were writing?
I was
doing
writing.
freelance?
I was hourly contracting,
Mm-hmm.
writing for this company. And so we were just like making it work. And I was relieved at first because I was super anxious in February when you could see the way things were going to go. And I was definitely like at the grocery store buying dry goods. And the lady was like, "What are you doing?" And I was like,
Yeah, my husband bought like 100-pound bag of flour. I was like, it's fine.
Yeah.
But fine, do what you want.
I went with lentils and split peas and a bunch of stuff.
Yuck. Farts.
And then, yeah. So I stayed home with him. And once I was begging him to stop going to the office for about 2 weeks before they closed it down. And then, so I was just relieved. And then I was like counting the 14 days, after he got home to be like, okay. Then I was just like, 409ing our groceries. And we watched a lot of we decided to start watching Baywatch.
Like as a whole family?
Well, me and David, after Griffin went to bed, we were like,
that's a weird choice. That's not what I thought
I think
you were going to
we
say.
need a show and we need to escape like mentally this moment. And so we started at the beginning with Baywatch.
It's February. Let's look at the beach.
Yeah.
Wow. I don't think I've ever seen an episode of Baywatch, although I did get this like high cut one-piece red bathing suit from Target, and this drunk lady in Mexico was like, "Hey, Baywatch." So
well, anyway, so that's what I was doing. I was taking care of a 2-year-old all day, and
spraying
I was
bleach on groceries.
kind of bored, and then and lonely, and then pretty quickly we potted up with my mom and her partner, and I wrote like a 3-page pod rules document. Totally normal. And
were signatures required?
No, but like a very intense conversation spearheaded by me.
Yeah.
And then and then we put our plans to have a second kid on hold until September of that year, when I was like, life has to go on.
Mm-hmm, and finally, I feel like you've been home from work long enough to have sex with you. It's safe. Yeah.
So how about you? What was it like?
I had a almost 2-year-old and a newly 4-year-old. The almost 2-year-old was in a home daycare kind of nanny-ish situation and was kind of getting ready to transition to preschool, to the preschool where my son went. It's funny, you talked about like learning about anxiety right before the pandemic. I taught a workshop on March 10th, I believe, to parents about managing anxiety in your kids.
Wait, in person?
In person.
Oh, boy.
It was like the last in-person thing I did.
Event. Yeah.
Yeah, we were patient zero. No, we didn't share pens and we did elbow daps, but we decided to go through with it. Wow. It was like if it had happened the next day, it wouldn't have
No
happened.
one at that workshop had real anxiety, I would say, because we canceled like everything like starting on like March 1st, and people were like,
that wasn't what happened here. It was still like kind of appropriate.
Yeah.
And so like it was with a school district. They were pretty safe about stuff, but we did it. And then, last minute I put some slides in and some examples about the pandemic, because kids were already starting to talk about it.
Yeah.
So that was very fitting. And then I got some, emails from those parents over the next few weeks that was like, thanks so much. It's been really useful. So I was home with those kids. My husband was working for an ad agency. I was working mostly doing assessment with kids and teaching grad students. So my assessments just stopped. I stopped seeing kids in my office, and I started going online to teach my students. I was teaching them how to do assessments with kids. So we had to figure out how to get them practice without real people, and how to even get them like the test kits that they needed to do this.
And were your kids like, what were your 2 and 4-year-old doing while you did that?
I would teach in the evenings.
Okay. Gotcha.
I was mostly on with my kids all day, although my husband kind of quickly realized with delight that like if he didn't go into the office, his work really only took like 4 hours a day. So he definitely did some. And then in the summer he was laid off. And so then we really split childcare. But, for a few months, definitely, like everyone else, it was just us like, we turned our dining room table into an art table, and it has never gone back, even through a move. It's just like, that's where art happens.
I see
we
that.
did a lot of
like I drive
virtual
by people's
stuff.
houses and I'm like, that's your art. Like you see like a sun porch that is now like an art zone, and you're like, right. Oh, that's like a pandemic.
That's a relic. Yeah. Exactly. Yeah. And we had a co-housing community, but everybody was really stringent for a long time. So we got to see people like, I would walk into the backyard and wave to someone. Or in April, when my 2-year-old had her birthday party, we did it in the backyard, and the neighbors' kids peered over the fence and sang and like blew a bubble machine, and then like didn't eat the cake because I had desperately tried to make it with gloves and not let anybody touch it. And then my 4-year-old touched it at the end, and I kind of fell apart. It was like this metaphor for could we be in community, and we couldn't.
Yeah.
So that was my kind of, early spring.
Yeah. With the pandemic little kid birthday, like the things we did, like Griffin turned 3 in December of 2020. And I remember, so it was dumping rain, freezing cold. And I was like, we'll do a drive-by birthday. And, we put out balloons and a big, like, covered area for him to sit in. And I filled a pump pot full of hot chocolate and individual little cups. And I said, like, drive by and, we'll hand you a hot cocoa. And Griffin. And of course, like, Griffin was barely 3. He's like, I don't want to sit out here in the rain. So it was just me, like, greeting random friends who would drive it for the parents for like 2 hours. Being like, why did I do this?
Well, I'm an extrovert. That's my dream. Yeah, I mean, I also just want to add, like, we're talking about logistics, but the vibes were real chaos. I mean, I was still, I think I don't know if it was postpartum depression, but I was really out of sorts, overwhelmed with my first baby, basically until I had a second one 2 years later. And then I felt like I was, punched while I was down.
Yep.
And I was still really in that kind of reeling from having 2 kids, feeling really insecure about my parenting, feeling like I wasn't sure what my professional identity was. And then the pandemic hit. So I was definitely crying in the car every day. Yeah, especially those first few months. The most beautiful thing was that my dad read to my 4-year-old every night on Zoom about like Greek mythology, which they're both really into. And he did it so much that he ran out of books, which is, I cannot tell you how many Greek mythology books my dad has. Wow. So like one night I came in and he was reading an Italian book about Hermes and translating it in real time to my son.
Wow.
Like, who was riveted. And I was like, this is love.
Yeah.
This is what love is.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, it's nice for me to have that picture as we kind of go into thinking about all of these friends and strangers who took our survey.
Yes.
So
thank you everyone, by the way.
Yeah, thank you. We really for taking it and sharing it. And over the next couple weeks, we'll be airing some brief episodes that are conversations with some of the people who took the survey, whose stories we found particularly interesting. So we're really excited about that and grateful to those people.
I think emblematic, right? Like I felt like we also chose people who said things that many people said, and I think that's what struck me was like how much overlap. It was, I just wish everyone could read all of these results because it was so validating. And I learned a lot about how not alone I was.
Yeah. And still, and how much company I still have.
Yeah.
So we had 472 respondents. We both asked people questions for a living. And I don't know about you, Miranda, but this was the most responded to thing I'd ever done. I didn't know if, 10 people would do it. Mm-hmm. Remember we had a goal of like 100.
Yeah.
And we were like, if it's 100, it'll be cool.
Mm-hmm.
but it far exceeded that for us. We had some demographic spread, people from all over the US
And
and some,
beyond.
yep,
Yeah.
some folks from other countries. We did have, you know, some real skew with kind of like 90% of our families, of our respondents identifying as white. We
Yeah.
tried to get some demographic variety, but that proved harder than we thought. And with about 90% making $90,000 or more as a family.
Yeah.
So I just want to shout that out. You know, these are middle and high income white folks for the most part. And that definitely, you know,
Yeah.
informs these experiences.
Yeah.
Yeah.
A surprising number of dads. I was
Yeah, we got some dads.
surprised
Shout out
by
to the
that.
dads.
Yeah.
They are cool.
Yeah.
So, Miranda, looking at this data, what pops out to you?
Yeah. Well, so kind of obvious, like, you know, obviously it was a time of anxiety, and that anxiety is still with people.
Yeah.
And I know I was really struck by the repetition of phrases along the lines of, I feel like anytime, I feel like one of the things I learned is that I feel like at any time it could all go away. Like the
Yeah.
rug could be pulled out from under me, and I can't unknow that. Like I experienced that and I can't unknow that. And but so, you know, that's obviously something that is people are still just living with and doing
Right.
life.
We had 57%, I think, of our respondents say that they continue to see negative impacts of the pandemic on their mental health.
Yeah, and then
as parents.
But then on the flip side, when we asked people, is there anything you miss about that time? I mean, tons of people said no. And that was really funny too. It was just like a hard no. And then a lot of people mentioned that they really miss the pace, like the slower pace. They miss quiet. They miss time with their kids without social obligations. Like people called out the clear schedule, the like quiet of that, the no obligation, the no guilt.
Can I pull in a few quotes?
Yes.
I liked one respondent said, the empty calendar, cozy reading time, being in nature as a family, watching shows together, no rushing. Someone said small, weird projects, lots of time with women I love. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
I also mothered alongside a lot of other mothers and missed that.
Yeah, I think that was really hard about, you know, we moved houses and we moved neighborhoods since the pandemic. And the people that were my neighbors in the pandemic, I don't think anyone will ever feel like those relationships. You know, the people who we waved at across the street every day, or, you know, just like peering across the street and seeing.
Yeah. Shout out to our neighbors, Tom and Mary, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think that the nostalgia really hit me too. And there were a range of things that people were nostalgic for. People talked about, like, I loved this quote. Someone said that they missed the sense that anything was possible, that it was a time for new ideas, new connections between people, and time to create new practices and traditions. Do you resonate with that?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, yeah. I miss the, you know, I realized that having a second kid, I've never had the time with her that I had with Griffin. And I realized that what is odd about my time with Griffin was that time with Griffin. Like we had nowhere to go and no one to see. And we could take like 2-hour walks because that's all there was to do. So it was like, good Lord, let's take our time. And
yeah, there were a lot of people with multiple children who reflected on the fact that they had a different experience with the children who were young in the pandemic, and that it was mostly positive, that like they hadn't stayed home with their older children, but this baby they really got to know, or their partner who had gone back to work very quickly actually got to spend time with this young child, or they got to kind of watch their toddler's milestones in a way that they hadn't with older kids. So that was interesting. I didn't have, you know, older kids to kind of compare it to.
Yeah, a lot of people said that they feel that the bonds that they made with their children like are extra deep because of this time, and that they're really grateful for that. We
had 80% of parents say that they felt like the pandemic had positive, lasting impacts on their family. Not overall, but that there were some.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, shout out to, the range of responses that there were, honest people like this respondent who said, how dare you ask if I'm nostalgic for the pandemic? I did love the relationship my kid forged with their nannies, but I chalk that up to them, not the pandemic. The pandemic can retro fuck itself.
Yeah, I think so. Someone says a lot of people talked about bonds with kids, and then I think marriages were tested, obviously, and some people are like, I realized how great my partner is, and then a lot of people are like, we are now headed for divorce.
Yeah, the word close came up 100 times in our responses, like close knit, tight knit, and the word divorce came up 36 times.
Yeah. There's an interesting, I can read this one quote. It tore us apart in a lot of ways, the pandemic, and put a spotlight on how different and how understanding or not we are about those differences. However, for people that I love who were willing to make it work, it was lovely to see how we showed up for each other. So I think a lot of people talked about that, like, oh, I had known that community was important in like a theoretical way. But now in the pandemic, I experienced like, oh, I have to like get to know my neighbors. And then some people, like you mentioned, we had a lot of geographical diversity. And I think some people were like, oh, wow, my community sucks. Or like, I don't have that. Or I feel incredibly isolated because the people around me feel very differently from me. And quite a number of people made moves because of the pandemic, and
physical moves,
like out of the city to the country or to be closer to their parents, and they lost community in that, and then that is a way that it's still with, I think, a lot of people, is like they made these massive changes.
There a lot of people wrote about community. One of the questions we asked was, what, if anything, did the pandemic show or teach you about your communities, your neighborhood, your city, your school? And there was just a lot of increased trust, connection, gratitude, despite a lot of difficulties. So that was really meaningful.
Yeah, it was. Well, I'm really glad we have these conversations coming. And I think that I hope it will be cathartic for listeners to hear some of our respondents really dig into their own kind of reflections on that time. And
well, what was interesting was, Miranda, we've talked about this, was how cathartic it seemed to be for people to respond to this.
Yeah.
We got a lot of people when we asked, is there anything else you want to tell us? Or many people followed up and wrote us additional emails.
Yes.
When saying that they had kind of not wanted to answer this at first. And when they'd seen somebody share, like, do you want to talk about your experiences parenting in the pandemic? They wanted to like throw the phone across the room. But then it was really validating and meaningful for them to talk about it. And a lot of people thanked us for giving them, I don't want to like give ourselves flowers. We did it selfishly too, but thanked us for giving them the opportunity to talk about it. That was not something I expected.
No, that was really cool. And, and it was a very, like you said, it was the last question of the survey. It was just, anything else you want to add? And I think we threw that in as just like, okay, in case our questions weren't, I kind of saw it as like, maybe we missed some big question that we should have asked. So people may naturally have a response. And the idea that people were of their own volition, just being like, oh my gosh, thank you for... A lot of times people said, thank you for giving me the space to process this. I hadn't stopped to think it through, because parents are, of course, like, we're just doing the day. We're like doing the grind. And I don't think there is space for reflection. And as something you and I have talked about, is the sense of it being taboo, not just in like digital media, but also in real life, in social environments.
Right, like we can joke.
Yeah, but you don't know what people want to talk about.
Sincerely.
We know that it was traumatic for people too, right? So you don't want to kind of be like, so what did you do in the spring of 2020? Like, how was that for you? Because someone might just burst into tears. And some of our respondents mentioned moments like that. Like someone who thanked us mentioned that um, they say about a year in, a doctor asked me how old my kid was, and when I said 5, she said, "Oh, that must have been a hard age with COVID," and I burst into tears.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think many
Mm.
of us really need this processing
Yeah.
time, and it wasn't all bad, right? I mean, it was horrible, and I think we want to learn the lessons. A lot of us want to learn from it.
Yeah, I want to point out kind of one more theme that I think is the one that I've been mulling over the most, particularly because, you know, I hope we will not have another pandemic. I know that people are worried about that, especially with, Trump, desire to dissolve the
It's a perfect
CDC, et
storm, a
cetera.
climate
Yeah.
disaster, and.
But whether or not that happens, I think that we continue to have a lot of experiences more and more as our society and our planet evolves that echo the pandemic. And so, for example, the fires in LA displaced a lot of families, and I've been doing a little bit of parent coaching with some of those families. I just was like, what can I do? Like, I was looking at the matrix that Liz Doerr talked about when she was on here, about kind of like what brings you joy? What skills do you have? And I was like, well, I can offer parent coaching. So I set out this thing that was like, if you've been affected by the fires,
because you're not a firefighter, right? Like, you're not going to go clear brush or whatever.
But it's a hard time for parents. I'm happy to give you a free session. So I've talked to a few families, and it's interesting to me how much it feels like the pandemic. And a lot of these families have younger kids, so they weren't where we were in the pandemic. And my being able to say, actually, I've been through a time of incredible uncertainty and anxiety with my children before, and this is what I've learned. And I think that there's also something that one of our parents said, Christine, who we interview in one of the upcoming episodes, who is an educator, where she talked about how it was a really fucked up time, the pandemic, to be telling parents that if they were just more responsive or more gentle or more scheduled, that they could get out of this, right? And that they could protect their kids from stress and trauma, right? There was a huge, the pandemic was when Dr. Becky got really popular. A lot of people were home, and a lot of parents were stressed and didn't know what to do. So it was a great place to get parenting content out there. And I think there's a lot of good stuff in a lot of that content, but there was a lot of pressure and a kind of a mythology that you could parent your way out of this difficult situation that you had no control over. And I think when we talk about how kids experience the pandemic and how they've had lasting impacts, when we asked our parents that question in this survey, like, do you still see negative impacts on your kid? Only a third of them said yes. And I think what we've seen is that kids were pretty resilient, that when we can kind of trace those lines of trauma from the pandemic to how kids are now, a lot of times we can't, because as Christine said so wisely, there's no control kid, right? To compare it to.
And that's a lot of parents are anxious about that. I want to
right. But a lot of those things were outside the home. A lot of those stresses had to do, I'm not blaming school, but had to do with things that were out of our control, like being out of school and missing out on developmental learning, right? Missing out on socializing. And so I think that it stands as an example of just how much we can't do as parents, how much pressure we put on ourselves, and the fact that life is kind of scary and childhood is hard. And this was a major, this was that on steroids, but that we need to give ourselves some kind of grace. And so, I mean, for me, that was why I wrote during the pandemic, is because I was so stressed, and I was also so convinced that I was doing a terrible job. And I would like to go back to my 2020 self and be like, all you got to do is try to be loving to yourself and your kids. And there's no other way to get through this. You're not gonna strategize and script your way through this. And
Yeah.
so you can fucking just relax a
Hmm.
little.
Yeah.
You're doing your best.
Yeah. Yeah.
That's my rant about that. I don't know. Does any of that strike you or feel like
Yeah.
um, something that you took from the pandemic about, you said at the top that you were nervous about illness, about how much control that we have as parents?
Yeah. I think it was a time when a process that was probably already in motion got like ramped up. And I think this is probably true for a lot of people for a lot of different things, whether it's like your marriage turned out to be crappy or, many things were emphasized in that time. And I think my um you could call it radicalization. I mean, I think I saw the systems clearly in that time, right? Like and the fractures in our
Right.
systems.
That's
And
so much of what Jessica Gross wrote about so well. Yeah.
yeah,
How
and I think
structures have failed parents.
I was happy, right? I was really happy alone with my kid, actually. I loved that level of control in a way that is not healthy for me at all, right? Like
Mm.
it was not
I was
healthy.
not happy and it wasn't healthy.
Right. And
So
what was happening to me was my perfect ideal, right? Which is that we are never exposed to viruses and no
oh,
one, messes with the way that I'm parenting and I don't have to
yeah.
see, right? And I get
Your
to,
bizarro,
right.
like kind of fucked up
Hyper,
fantasy of parenting.
yeah, hyper
It's just us in a
control,
house.
right?
Wow. That's
And
fascinating.
so, but I could also, and then it became sad, right? Then it became a bummer. And then it was like, well, this is actually terrible. And also, um, and then as things progressed and he got older and we had another child, um, then I was also so heartbroken by the way that children and families were left behind, like the way that the world opened up again as soon as
Hmm.
adults could be vaccinated.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. It was hard to watch
it was
that.
about it was like 8 or 9 months.
Yeah.
It felt like 7 years between when adults could be vaccinated and small children.
Yeah.
But we had to stop seeing people. We had opened up our world um and then we had to close it down again. Nellie was born um in the Delta wave, and so I had been vaccinated, and then we thought things were going to open back up, and then suddenly we had a newborn and there was a new wave, and our small children weren't vaccinated, and so it was really lonely. And um friends of ours kids were in school and over
Mm.
fives had been vaccinated, and so
Yeah.
my under fives were not, and we just felt really really isolated again.
Mm.
And then I having to like ask people to wear masks again when they were so thrilled that they could be living this relatively normal life. So
Yeah. And
as
talk about marginalization. Like, I think if you talk to the disabled and chronically ill
right,
community, a lot of them still feel
yes,
that way.
yes,
That they've
absolutely.
just been left behind by people who aren't as
And they
vulnerable.
have been. I mean, I think,
Yeah.
yeah, they're totally right. And I think, and by people who don't bother to get vaccinated. I mean, anyway, yeah,
Yeah. As a
the
whole.
vaccine thing was
Hmm.
really lonely. And the American Academy of Pediatrics also reflected on that as a huge mistake. And their recommendation is that next time the children's vaccine is tested right along with the adult, that there's no delay. They don't see there a reason for
Hmm.
that. And
Oh, yes. Yay for learning.
that was a beautiful.
Yeah. I think that my version of that, of like, now you're in like, hyper version of what you think you should be doing as a parent, was that I was having a really hard time putting my kids in full-time childcare. I really didn't like being home with my kids. I love my kids. Every day that I had to spend alone with one or both of my kids felt like a nightmare. It felt like a job that, like, when you pull up to the parking lot, you get that sinking feeling and you're like, maybe I'll get fired today. And so, but I wasn't listening to that because I thought that was being a bad mom and that I had to kind of push through it. And I was forcing myself to do that, to work part-time and not send my kids to preschool 5 days a week, because I was like, they need more time with their parents and it's not an option for my husband. And it was bad. And so then the pandemic was like, I think it forced me to be like, I got to get the fuck out of here and get these kids some childcare.
Yeah.
So in, I think, May or June of 2021, in that moment that you're talking about,
Yeah.
that the adults were vaccinated
Yeah.
and you were still inside, I went to New York City with my vaccinated self and without my kids. And I gathered so many colors to take home from that.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and I definitely devoted myself more to being away from them, even if I didn't feel like it was worthwhile.
Yeah.
We put them in full-time care once we could.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I do think, I
never looked back.
We both started writing around the same time. I had been a food and drink writer for like a decade before I had kids. And then it was in 2021 after Nellie was born that I connected with Megan O'Connell from Romper and was like,
Megan.
And I was like, hey, I noticed that like every mom is on antidepressants and I really want to write about it. And she was like, sure. And and that
Megan was my first freelance editor.
Yeah,
she accepted my first piece about Emily Oster. Again, that was like another parenting voice where I was like, stop telling us that we can like optimize this.
Yeah.
So I wrote that piece for Romper in the fall of 2021, and she was the first editor that published me.
Yeah, same. And she's also like my favorite editor. She's
she's the reason we're friends, really.
She's the elephant in the room on this podcast.
Yeah, so I think we both started writing about parenting more.
Yeah.
Right? Like we got to talk about this.
Yeah, it was a form of connection seeking too. It was when after Nellie was born, I was prescribed Zoloft and I was like, it was the dumbest thing. I was like, I totally had the 3-day crash. And like, I went to my, it was just like the third day after delivery.
Placenta withdrawal, right?
Yeah.
I didn't know about this until you taught me about it.
Yeah, this is the dumbest thing, right? So I didn't know about it either. And then I was like, okay, I'm crazy. I feel crazy. And I go into my, I called like the hotline on the paperwork and was like, hi, someone can talk to me. And they were like, sure, in 5 days, we have a person who's available over Zoom, right? And you're like, I'm freaking out. So I go into my OB and she's like, it sounds like you have postpartum anxiety. Here's a prescription for Zoloft. It'll take 8 weeks to kick in. And you're like, excuse me, right? So I was like, but you're there and you're so grateful that someone's talking to you and you're just like, great, thank you.
Right.
And I go
that
home.
They're just even looking at you without disgust.
Yeah, and I go home and it's just a horrible, and I text my friend Brett, who I think will be one of our COVID conversations, who has 2 little kids and is a doctor in Montana. And I said, Brett, like, what terrible thing will happen if I take an Ativan tonight? Because I have to like sleep. And she was like, it should be fine. She's like, if your baby seems sedated, rush to the ER, but that probably won't happen. I was like, okay. So, but I was that desperate. I was like, okay. So I took an Ativan.
Oh, that must have been hard for you.
It was very hard. And I slept and then I was better, and it was a process, but I was drastically better after just getting over that little hump. And then a week later, I finally had that doula appointment that they set up, and in the first 10 minutes over Zoom, she was like, oh, you had a classic 3-day hormone crash.
So are you saying you didn't need the Zoloft and we're overprescribing it?
Zoloft was absolutely not what I needed in that moment. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with Zoloft, but it was completely the wrong thing. And then for some people, it's perfect.
Oh, I wish I'd been your friend and I could have come over.
Well, no one could come over because... anyway, it was terrible. I could have
put up a sign in your window that said, I love you. You're going to survive this.
Thank you. That, I got through and people helped me, but then when I figured all of this out, and then every mom I talked to was like, oh, I'm on Zoloft too, or I'm on Lexapro, I'm on Wellbutrin. And then I started hearing stories of what everyone had been on and changed and tried different things. And I was like, wait a minute, we're all on this and we're not
let's talk
talking about it.
Yeah.
And So
I'll say one last theme from the survey that I wanted to make sure we covered is that I think is about something that a lot of people are feeling, but we maybe don't know everybody is feeling, which is that, again, in this demographic group that, that we primarily surveyed, that there's still I hate the way we throw trauma around, but
Yeah.
it really does meet the definition. There is an old part of us that gets triggered and confused whenever our for a lot of parents when their
Yes.
kids get sick
Yes.
or when school is canceled.
Yes.
And we talked about this during both of our school strikes, you know, that and I noticed that on with the other parents during our school strike just a few years ago, that it felt so much scarier because we'd had this experience of school shutting down and being gone, you know, for a lot of parents for over a year.
Yes.
And so that gets pulled up for a lot of parents when their kids get the flu, when there's, you know, snow days even.
Fever, just
and
a fever. I mean, I feel like the anxiety of what do I do? And it's like COVID tests aren't free. You can't test every runny nose. You can't you know, and the like feeling of, for me, it's a decision, it's an extreme form of like decision fatigue and overwhelm where it's like,
right.
I just want someone else to tell me what to do, but I know that no one's going to, and I'm gonna have to figure it out myself. And if I make the wrong choice, something terrible is gonna happen. And also, how am I gonna get my work done? And also,
Right.
and it's all just right there.
Right.
Like,
And then there's this additional piece of like, even if I'm just like, my kid has the flu, he's going to be sick for a week.
yeah.
That feeling like maybe this won't go away, you know, the first time it happened to me, I think, was the strike. And I was really confused. I started like having incredible grief when school closed because of the strike. And again, this was like 2023.
Yeah.
And we had been back to school forever. And I was like lying in bed, depressed and sobbing.
Yeah.
And it took me days to realize, and it was other parents saying it, that it was like pandemic trauma, that I was remembering having my kids home. I was remembering what it was like to do that for so long and how hard it was. So I think it's another way where, you know, if we can just have these conversations with each other and even to share that as a community, to tell the teachers, it was meaningful to me to be like, we support you. And I think a lot of parents are having pandemic trauma right now.
Oh yeah. I mean, our strike went on for the whole month of November, and it was so hard, and it brought up also that those fears again of like, is my kid okay? If I feel this way, what are they feeling? You know, like, it for me, that was kind of like tiptoeing around Griffin's feelings about being home, and I could see that it was confusing for him too. He wasn't sure if it would go back, you know, and I mean, I think that it's all with us. It's all still with us. It's all still very present. 5 years isn't that long. And then also, I mean, I assume for you, I assume for everybody, you know, we didn't ask specifically about illnesses, but at least anecdotally in my circles, like winter of 2021, 2022, and then the following winter were horrendous for disease. Like once we opened up again, we all got we were sick from September to May, like quite sick. And then I wrote about for Romper, like there were Tylenol shortages. There was amoxicillin shortages. I remember
things that have happened since then.
It's not great, right? Like supply chain.
It's not like everything went back
us.
to the way that it was too. It revealed a lot of things, cracks in society that have continued to crack.
And that's scary, right? I think a lot of us, people did mention this. Like I have like a 4-bottle deep supply of like kids Motrin. I never would have had that before, you know, but now I'm like, I'm not running out of that. Like, you know, a little bit, my anxiety is never going away. I've made peace with that, but
I think we should end with, I just want to shout out a few of my favorite responses, particularly about pandemic nostalgia. And I want to invite people to think about if this, you know, triggers some nostalgia for you. Again, you know, what are we in control of? You're probably not going to quit your job and, you know, and make the air cleaner instantly. But are there ways to, you know, fold this back into your life in some form, maybe looking a little bit different?
You can
one
comment
of my favorite
on our Substack post for this episode.
Yeah, we would love that.
That would be a beautiful place to leave your own like reflections. I would love to read them.
So, all right, you want to just do a few?
Yeah, tell me yours.
Okay. There was a phase. So this is what do you miss, if anything? There was a phase where our boys decided to go fully nude for a few months. That was funny and interesting.
I like that.
The financial support through government, other programs.
Oh, yeah.
No FOMO. An excuse not to see people I don't want to see. Lol. Let's see. Our block went out and sang every evening at 7 p.m. for the first summer. That was amazing.
Mm-hmm.
It was high stress, but low pressure. I miss feeling that creating fun at home is a priority. The unhinged sense of humor we developed. I miss writing letters and telling everyone I love them more frequently.
Mm-hmm.
We did more camping and outdoor activities. We don't have time for those now with sports and organized activity.
Mm-hmm.
Feeling more fulfilled from simple adventures like walking to the coffee shop. The feeling of seeing friends in a backyard for the first time. Feeling like the earth was getting a break from us. I remember running over I-5 and seeing no cars on it. What a wonder.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I
Pandemic.
So much.
Happy anniversary.
Yeah, I guess you did it. You did it.
You did it. You did it, parents.
Yeah. And still doing it.
And let's keep talking. Let's keep having these conversations,
yes.
huh?
Yeah,
But
I think
not next time, not in so many years.
Yeah, I think a takeaway could be just that people do want to talk about it.
Yeah.
Like and I think people were maybe it seemed like in the process of responding were themselves realizing that they want to talk about it.
Yeah.
And maybe it's just that we're only ready now. Maybe it's just that we're starting to be ready to talk about it. Yeah.
Okay. Thank you all. Thank you to everybody who responded and everyone out there who's letting themselves think about something that maybe is a little beautiful and also quite painful. We're with you.
Yeah.
And thanks, Miranda, for telling your own story.
Thanks, Sarah.
The Mother of It All is produced by Opus Knox Media with music from It's Electric. If you like this episode, why not send it to a friend right now? Go on. We'll wait. You can follow us on Substack at themotherofitall.substack.com, where subscribing will get you episodes and bonus posts in your inbox and connect you with the Mother of It All listener community. Plus, become a paid subscriber and get a hot off the presses Mother of It All canvas tote. We're also on Instagram at The Mother of It All, and you can email us anytime with ideas or feedback at motherculturepod@gmail.com.